So I preached 4 times across the street, so I'm hesitant to. It reminds me, once I spoke to a foster grandparent gathering, and they invited me the next summer, and it's the same people. It was basically the same message, and I thought, why are they inviting me the second time? And I finished the talk, and this old foster grandmother came up to me, and I think she liked the talk because she had tears in her eyes, and she grabbed my hands, and she said, "I heard you last year. It never gets better." So I will avoid giving the homily I gave 4 times. I'm sick of hearing myself. So, here's what I think about Main Street Ministries. I think you've chosen to imitate the kind of God we have by longing to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. And so what you've done is you've connected yourself to the imagination of God and Jesus to imagine a circle of compassion, and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle. You've chosen to dismantle the barriers that exclude, and you do it in a very particular way. You welcome as God welcomes the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and those whose dignity has been denied, and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. You've chosen to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. I suspect if kinship happened to be our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice, we'd be celebrating it. No kinship, no peace. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no equality. No matter how focused we are on those goals and they're worthy, unless there's some undergirding sense that we belong to each other, not much can happen. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we step out to the margins? Because that's the only way they will get erased. Look under your feet. They get erased if you stand there. And you brace yourselves because people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "In this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." You make those voices heard. Today we celebrate Palm Sunday and we begin Holy Week, and Jesus enters into Jerusalem. But he's really announcing in this humble way, sitting on a donkey, he's announcing a new God, if you will, and a new way of reflecting that God in the world. He announces the God who he receives as a tender glance, and then he chooses to be tender in the world. For the truth is, only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of saving the world, changing the world, or altering the course of things. I had a spiritual director once who said to me, we need a better God than the one we have. And he's right. We settle for a partial God, a lesser God, a puny God. We settle for the God we've created in our own image. And Lamont always says, you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. The homies are always teaching me things. 30 years I've worked with gang members, and the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than these thousands of men and women I've been privileged to know. I went to San Fernando Juvenile Hall once to say Mass, and a big old gym, 500 gang members mainly, males, minors. And I was sitting there, and I was vested. I was wearing an alb and a stole, and I had this little sheet that everybody had, and it had the readings in English and Spanish. And I thought, well, I'm not going to read along. I'm going to listen. So I sat there, and I put this sheet on my lap, and the homies came up, and they did the first reading, and then homie got up and did the psalm, and there was kind of in his voice, as I had my eyes closed, there was an overabundance of confidence. And he got up and he said, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, "What the hell?" And it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. That is a better God than the one we have. There's the God we actually have, and then there's the one we've settled for, the partial God. But the God we actually have is exhausted, so anchored in you, so centered in having you know that he loves you without measure and without regret. The exalted God is kind of the God we've created in our own image, because there isn't anybody in this room or outside of it who, if you were God, you would want to be exalted. But ours is so generous and so other-centered and so humble that it's kind of not about him. Wow. That is an awesome God. And so we're called to reflect that in our lives by seeking, what Sonia was talking about, essentially the exquisite mutuality. There is no us and them. The feeling's mutual. We are connected to each other. All of us are called to be enlightened witnesses, people who through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love return people to themselves. At Homeboy Industries, the largest gang intervention program on the planet, where we get 15,000 folks a year walking through our doors, we're kind of allergic to the idea of holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up. Because our exhausted God doesn't do that. Why would we do that to each other? Instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, knowing that my truth is your truth, and your truth is a gang member's truth. It's all the same truth. Here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. And then you watch folks on the margins as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But all of us are invited to reach in and dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. Marcus Borg, the scripture scholar, says that the principal suffering of the poor throughout history and throughout scripture is shame and disgrace, and I think that's quite right. How do we reach in? We've talked a lot about awe and awesome, and in the Acts of the Apostles it says oddly this one line, "And awe came upon everyone," and it seems to suggest that the measure of health in any community anywhere may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So I give talks sometimes on half-time in the office dealing with gang members, and I'm on the road a fair amount, and I got invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia. And it was one of those all-day gang in-service things from 9 to 5. And I said yes. I figured maybe I'll speak at the beginning, or maybe I'll speak at lunch, or maybe I'll close the day. And so I bought my ticket, and a week before I was to fly, I pulled the letter out, and to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker at this gang conference from 9 to 5. And I said to myself, oh, hell no, I'm not going to do this whole thing. So I invite 2 homies in who are part of our 18-month training program, Andre and Jose. And they're like in their 16th month of our 18-month training program. And so I sit them down and I said, look, you're flying with me at the end of the week to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up and tell your stories. Take your time, because we got a long-ass day to fill. But I'd never heard their stories. And Jose gets up, and he's 25 years old, gang member, tattooed, been to prison. But in his, by his 16th month with us, he ended up becoming a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery, and now helping younger homies with their addiction issues, and in prison a long time, but also had a long stretch as a homeless man, even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and he begins and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers audibly gasp. And then he says, it sounds way worse in Spanish, he said to them. And we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. I think I was 9, he said, when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage, and she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through. Second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. And that's what you do here. And the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. Let me end with this. Years ago I was interviewed on the Christian Broadcasting Network, and this woman asked me, what do we do at Homeboy Industries? I said, well, we've been around for 30 years and largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on the planet. It's a community of tenderness where people can find transformation, where they heal the damage. Free tattoo removal, classes, anger management, therapy. We have 9 social enterprises where rival enemy gang members who used to shoot at each other bake bread and run a restaurant and print shirts. So I went on and on and on like that. And then she kind of made a face and she said, yeah, but how much time each day do you spend, praising God? And I didn't know what to say. So I looked at her and I said, all damn day. I don't believe she liked that answer very much. But it begs this question, and it's a worthy question. What kind of praise does our exhausted God have any interest in? So I have 2 books now, but when I had 1 book called Tattoos on the Heart, it would occur to universities to invite me to speak there after they had forced their students to read my book against their will. So I was invited by my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane. Hey. Exactly. I had them in my Final Four, but oh well. So but my bracket got busted way before them. So anyway, so they said, come and speak. We forced the freshman class to read your book. And it'll be a big venue, Tuesday night, 1,000 people. And could you come? And I said, sure. Could you bring 2 homies with you? And I always bring homies if people are going to pay for it. And so, and I always pick homies the same way. I always pick enemies, rivals who work at Homeboy, just to have them share a hotel room just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky, you know. And so not long ago, I was flying to Washington, D.C. with 2 older vatos, and one of them, dead serious, said, hey, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, well, yes, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked 2 homies. I picked Bobby, an African-American gang member who at the time worked in the bakery, and Mario, who worked at the time in our merchandise store where we sell our logo stuff. And I've done this hundreds and hundreds of times. I've never, ever picked anybody more absolutely terrified, petrified of flying than this guy Mario. It was actually kind of frightening me a little bit. He was hyperventilating, you know, and we hadn't even boarded the plane yet, you know. And so we were at Burbank Airport, which is a tiny airport, big bay windows, Southwest Airlines mainly, big planes, but a small airport. And they don't have that hermetically sealed chute where you have to, you know, board the plane by getting on that thing. You have to walk out into the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the steps, the stairs at the front of the plane, and the big feature there is you have stairs at the back of the plane. And so I'm sitting there with Mario, and Bobby's off walking somewhere, and our plane arrives. It's early morning, and I say, well, that's our plane, and Mario says, and I think, wow, he may die before we actually climb up those stairs. And so then it's early morning, and so I watch our flight crew arrives, and there are 2 flight attendants, females, and both have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the steps to get to board the plane. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now, you know, perhaps I shouldn't have said that. I should tell you that in my 30-year history at Homeboy Industries, Mario is the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there, which is, trust me, saying a lot. He's all sleeved out. His neck is blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids, which say the end, so that when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt to those who peer in. And so I'd never been in public with him, so I'm walking through the airport to try to calm him down, and people are going like this, you know, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely. And I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting, because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and ask anybody there who's the kindest, most gentle, tender soul who works here, they won't say me. They'll say Mario. He now works behind the counter selling baked goods. He's proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance at changing the world. So we get to Gonzaga, the big talk Tuesday night. What they don't tell you is they have 93 other talks planned for you. So all day long, classroom, lunch, meeting, classroom, all day. And so I told these guys, I'm not going to speak in any of these. I'm going to be at the back of the classroom. You get up, tell your stories. So they do stories of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. So the nighttime talk comes, and I said, hey, you guys get up before me, do 7 minutes each of your stories. And then I'll get up, and then I'll invite you to be part of the Q&A. And so that's what we did. And so when they're standing next to me, and I said, yeah, questions. Yes, ma'am. And a woman stands, and she says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gates for Mario. And Mario's this tall, skinny drink of water, and he clutches the microphone. Yes. And he's just terrified. And she says, well, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter who are about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And Mario closes his eyes, and he's just trembling, and I can feel the emotions rising, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the sentence is going to be. And when suddenly he blurts out, and as soon as he says those two words, he retreats back to his microphone, clutching, trembling retreat. But he wants to get this sentence out, and I can feel that he's losing his battle with his tears. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving. You are kind. You are gentle. You are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. But they in turn also returned to themselves, which shouldn't surprise us because it's mutual. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. That you may be one, Jesus says. Jesus enters Jerusalem proposing a new God and a new way. And so he invites us to receive the tender glance of God and become that tender glance in the world. For only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has a shot at creating the community of kinship such that God might recognize it. And so we cease to care whether anyone accuses us of wasting our time as we stand at the margins and create such kinship. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much.